Welcome into episode 58 of the 5 Reasons podcast. I'm Ethan Skolnick here, as always, with Chris Whittingham. Thank you for finding us. We're on iTunes. Also, if you are an Android person, you can find us on Google Play, Stitcher, CastBox, and we recommend our hosting app, Podbean, because you can find all of the podcasts in our network grouped together. That includes Miami Heat Beat, 3 Yards Per Carry, our Miami Dolphins-centric podcast, Ballscast, which is hard to describe, except you have to be from Miami to really understand it, and you'll get a few laughs out of that every Friday. And also Pitch Invasion, which my co-host here, Chris Whittingham, has launched in advance of the World Cup, and that will be going every other day during the World Cup before it settles into a weekly schedule. Also, we've already announced 2 new podcasts in our network, Mark Your Territory on professional wrestling, and The Fish Tank, hosted by Dolphins great O.J. McDuffie and Seth Levitt. Both of those will be launching in July, with 2 others that we will have details on soon. All right, one of the things that we've tried to do here on the podcast is bring in guests who can bring a different perspective. We're really excited about this today, and especially on this day of all days, Amber Wilson, because this is the first day that you drove the morning show on 790 The Ticket. So you do, what is it, 3.5 hours of radio, getting up at the break of dawn to get over to the 790 studios, and then you decide to sit in with us. What would possibly compel you to make that decision?
To sit in with you, or to get up at the break of dawn? Because getting up at the break of dawn is less enjoyable than this right now. The worst part of hosting the morning show is getting up, that alarm going off at 4 in the morning. For sure. You would think you get used to it. I was told by other morning hosts that you never get used to it, and I'm starting to realize that I think that might be the case. You never get used to those early mornings.
Never, ever.
You never do. I did a year with Jeff DeForest and Leslie Visser over on 640. All I did every morning was get up, get there by about 5:30 in the morning. I know you have to be there a little earlier because your show starts earlier than ours did. And then I would go directly to the vending machine to take out some Cheetos. That was my breakfast.
Oh, my
every
God.
morning, I would go directly to get Cheetos and an iced tea, and I would snack on that during the first 3 hours of the program until we got out of there. And then I was covering the Dolphins at the time, so I would get out of that studio at 10 o'clock and drive to Davie to go to the Dolphins and cover their practices. It was not a fun year. I can say that.
I can't
know
even
Chris,
imagine how
how
unhealthy that is, though. I mean, like Amber, like from what I see on Instagram, like you're always eating healthy stuff. Like it's not Cheetos and iced tea in the morning.
Yeah, but
is
I
it
feel
not?
like maybe that's where I'm messing up, because you're right. My breakfast pretty much every morning is before I leave the house. I pour, like this morning, before I left the house in Tupperware, I poured a half a cup of raw oats, a couple scoops of protein powder, and some blueberries into a container with coconut milk, and ran out the door, and then just ate that cold a couple hours into the show, which that is not nearly as motivating as maybe Cheetos would be. So maybe that's where I'm going wrong, because there's nothing exciting about eating that horrendous protein oatmeal.
No, but the worst thing about the Cheetos was, so I would eat them, and then I would be in a hurry to get to practice, and on occasion, no matter how you wash your hands, there's still going to be some Cheeto dust, right? You can't get rid of it completely. And then I would be banging out a story after availability in Davie, and there would be Cheeto dust all over my computer from the morning. So yeah, not great memories. I know Chris has done a bunch of those morning shifts there too. But just before we get to the bulk of this podcast, what was it like driving for the first time in the morning?
It was a lot of fun. That's one thing that I really want to focus on this next year. So I've been at 790 now for 2 years. Now I'm finally on my second contract there. So what I kind of want this next phase to represent over the next year is getting more comfortable doing some things that I hadn't gotten to do before in radio. And that the biggest one being driving some shows. So I volunteered to work some shows on the weekend where I get to drive. So I'm doing that this Saturday. I'm driving a show with Zach Duarte, and I was able to drive the morning show today because Zaslow was out. And Tobin suggested to me, hey, you've been here a couple of years now, so when Zaslow's out, why don't you ask if you could drive the show? Because normally Tobin will step in and drive the show, but that's a lot for him because then he does the midday show as well. So I was able to do that this morning, and it was really fun. It was fun being at the controls. It's not as hard as Zaslow makes it look. He acts like it's brain surgery. It's not. No, it was a really good time. I had a lot of fun with the guys, and it was Tobin and Romberg filling in today. And I always have a lot of fun with those two. They're constant shenanigans.
And it's always nice. It's always nice that you also get it on a day that's one of those where you wake up in the morning, you see the big story, and it's like, oh, this will be an easy one. Because the Brian Colangelo story coming out, it's like, all right, I don't have to come up with material today. Let's just talk about this.
Which, goodness, this time of year, I mean, this is what we need, especially in
Correct.
South Florida. I mean, we're working off of nothing here, so any national story that breaks that's at least going to be interesting on a global scale and not just to, whatever market that story's in. I mean, that story isn't just interesting to 76ers fans, but now is leading to all these burner accounts. This is Burnergate now. So now all these burner accounts everywhere are being called into question, and is so-and-so a burner account? And so this Burnergate is giving radio hosts endless material, at least for a few days, which during this time of year you desperately need.
Yeah, and I can say for sure that some Heat executives have burner accounts. There's no question in my mind. We all talk about the we all talk about the PR 2620, right, which is the Pat Riley account,
right,
which we identified a few years ago because it was following everybody that Pat Riley would possibly follow. And I don't know if Spoelstra has one. He has his own account. He only tweeted from it once. But what people don't realize is his sister is actually a social media specialist. So I don't believe, based on some of the things that Eric knew were happening on social media, that he's totally oblivious to what's going on Twitter. And I can tell you, without naming them, that there are at least 3 Heat executives that have burner accounts. Just based on
the very important distinction to make is that they are not tweeting criticism about their players or other people in their front offices or other people that are in their front office, and they were not telegraphing trades a month before they happened. So that is a major distinction to make. They're just using it as an anonymous vehicle to follow the people that they ought to be following on social media.
We think so. We think so. But there are 10 members of Miami Heat Beat, so we haven't seen all of them on video. So it's very possible that a couple of them are actually Andy Ellisberg and Nick Harrison. I'm not saying.
We have no way of knowing.
We have no way of knowing. I'll just say that our DM string is going to get a lot more closed up if that's the case with some of the stories that we've been telling on there every night. So anyway, good topic there. I'm glad that you had something that you could jump into because, Amber, I can tell you from driving, and I actually found, honestly, I don't know how, Chris, you feel about this. I found it easier to drive than be the second person.
Really?
Yeah, I did. When Israel and I were doing the show together and I was the second person, I struggled with that, like where to jump in, where not to jump in. And I know you were driving with Josh.
Yep.
And then when Israel left, you and I were together and I drove, and I actually found that to be easier than sort of being the person who reacts. I think it just depends.
I am an advocate of less work, and so I am totally fine with playing off you. My mentality was just always like, even when I was hosting, I was trying to build a show around the people I'm co-hosting with because, for me, their engagement is more important than my engagement. So regardless of the format in which that happens, I'm fine.
Yeah, I think it's interesting you say that, Ethan, because I actually thought today I felt like I was fighting less to find my place. Like it was coming more naturally because obviously I was coming off the top of the segment. I could just say something and then look at them and then allow Tobin or Romberg to jump in. And I can see why you would think that that's an easier role, actually, because even though you have more quote unquote responsibility in that you have things that you're supposed to be reading and you're supposed to come into a segment and you throw out the idea, really you're throwing out the idea and then the person in the next seat has to react to wherever you're going. And I can understand why the reaction actually may be more complicated than the person who throws out the idea. That's interesting. And it's true. I mean, I would say that sometimes reacting to things when it's not your idea and it's not where you want to go on the show or on a topic that you're not at all interested in and the main host is, sometimes that can be difficult.
Yeah, I think it can be. And again, it depends also sort of, how strong the personality you're working with is and sort of how that flow goes. But I thought driving, I was able to shape it a little bit more and kind of get a feel for it. And especially, I think, too, you've got a 3-person booth in there in the morning. And I think when you're trying to engage 2 other people, and that's what Chris and I were trying to do because we always had Chris Perkins or Mike Wallace or Alex Marvez as our third. And so Chris and I together would try to sort of involve them in some way. And I found I actually found the 3-person shows to be easier than the 2-person shows, which I was doing after Chris left, just because we sort of were able to involve everybody's talents and get them to do stuff. But yeah, I'll be curious to see what you think after you do it for a little while, because clearly you're going to get more opportunities to do it, and that's a pretty cool thing. All right, I want to start here from the beginning with you, Amber, because I think people who don't know your story and don't understand what you were doing before you decided to get into sports radio might be surprised that you decided to get into sports radio. I know, and we can get into some of your work at CBS, and I mean, my first interaction working with you was actually at Sports Bang when you were doing television there with Stu and with Goldie, and then I would fill in from time to time. But can you sort of give a little bit of backstory about how you fell in love with sports and why someone who had a successful career starting would decide to get into this crazy business?
Well, a lot of people think that I just walked into radio. I don't think a lot of people realize how long I was in sports before taking this job. And I was actually in sports before becoming a lawyer, which I'm also a lawyer, but I went into sports first. So really, when I was like 12, I decided that I wanted to be a sports broadcaster. And when I was in middle school, my brother was in college at the University of Florida. He majored in telecommunications journalism. He majored in broadcasting. And he was in school with Erin Andrews. And they hosted the news together at the station, the campus station. And she was doing sports. And I remember I went up there and my brother told me that this is Erin. He introduced me to her and he told me privately, she's probably really going to make it. This is a girl who wants to do sports. And I thought, hey, that's pretty cool. There are women doing it. And obviously, of course, Leslie Visser and people like that had paved the way. But there still weren't a ton of women in the business at the time that Erin Andrews was young. Then she went into the business and I kind of watched her career develop. And obviously this influx of women come into the business. And by the time I got to college, I decided to major in the same thing that they had majored in and went after broadcasting out of college. Now, what I had also done, though, was I had also taken the LSAT, which is the entrance exam for law school. I had taken that as well right when I graduated, but I thought I'm going to chase this broadcasting dream first, and maybe I'll go to law school later. I come from a long line of lawyers, and I figured that was a career that I would enjoy as well. So I went into broadcasting, and my first year was full-time interning at TV 20, which is the local news station in Gainesville. I interned for free in their sports department, like 7 days a darn week. I'm sure anybody that you ask, and I know you guys had Stu Gatz on the podcast, I listened to some of it, and all of our stories, anybody in broadcasting who's had any sort of success, all of our stories involve a whole lot of climbing and clawing our way to any semblance of success. And that certainly was the case for me as well. And so I did this internship full time and I was waiting tables on the side, and I graduated college. I stayed there for that year after. And that happened to be a very good year, though, because that was during the time that the Gators went on their multi-championship run in college in basketball. And so I left after a year there and got my first job at CBS Sportsline. And that happened to be in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And I had never even, I didn't know a single person in Fort Lauderdale. I'm not sure I'd ever been to Fort Lauderdale, but that's where I got my first job. And so I moved down to Fort Lauderdale and I was their on-camera web host and mostly doing fantasy sports shows. And this was like mid-2000s. So this was really the very beginning of that. Now it doesn't sound crazy, but at the time that was groundbreaking and there wasn't much of a web presence. And so people didn't get it. I spent a couple years there and I went from 3 days a week to 5 days a week. So I went from part-time to full-time. I went through a couple contracts. I went from getting paid nothing to getting paid very, very well for being, 23, 24 years old. And things were taken off from me from that perspective, but it wasn't television, it was web. And back then that was just strange for people. So when I would send out my resume reel to agents or I would try to get jobs at TV stations, people didn't really understand that it was the same thing, that I was doing the same thing. So I spent a couple years there and this company, Open Sports, came along and recruited me away. And the reason that was desirable to me at the time was because they were offering to allow me to do more. So I was going to get a right for Open Sports in addition to doing web shows. It was a very similar format to CBSSports.com, but I was going to get to do more stuff, do some producing. And I thought, okay, this will round out my resume a lot more, and then I'll be able to jump into TV from there. And I went to Open Sports, and the economy crashed and everybody got laid off, and Open Sports folded within a year. And it was a difficult time. And I was going on all these television auditions, and so was these few other women in the business. It was kind of, we would show up at these auditions and it'd be kind of the same girls at every audition around the country. And I was auditioning all over, Philly, New York, all these places. And I decided during that time, hey, maybe this is when I cash in on that LSAT and I go to law school and kind of get serious about my life. Like, I've kind of chased the sports thing, and it worked to a degree because I had definitely some years in my 20s where I really enjoyed living in Fort Lauderdale. I was enjoying my life very much, and I was doing well for myself, and it just wasn't reaching the level that maybe I'd hoped. And so I thought, okay, maybe I'll go to law school. Maybe that's a career that has a little bit more security involved in it. And I decided to go to law school. I was down here still, so I applied to Miami Law because I couldn't imagine going back to a college town like Gainesville at that point. And I got into Miami Law. And then, of course, I finally landed one of those auditions, and I landed it at SNY Network in New York to host a TV show for them that was called Beer Money. And I did that for a year. That was in New York City. And I would just go around to bars and stadiums, and I would ask people sports trivia questions and give them money if they got trivia questions right. So it was a really fun gig, and they offered me a job off of that show, but it was a part-time job. And I thought, okay, am I going to be living in New York City permanently doing a part-time job? And I still have this Miami Law acceptance that I had deferred. And I thought, you know what, I'm just going to go to law school and finally do it, grow up, get my law degree, maybe be a lawyer, and started law school. And then what ended up happening was I ended up getting more TV work. I had done a television show for CBS Network. That was a few days out in Vegas. That was a baseball show. I started getting work here and there, and at the same time was still getting my law degree. And then I got the call from Stu Gatz to audition for Sports Bang, which of course is how I met Ethan. So I did Sports Bang for 3 years throughout law school, still graduated my law degree, worked for the Dolphins in their legal department during law school, worked for a sports and entertainment firm as well, graduated law school, did that in 2.5 years. It was a very busy period of my life, and came out and I practiced full time at a firm and still did Sports Bang because it was only 1 day a week for a few hours. And I was able to kind of stay in both businesses. And then, of course, when I decided to fully get out and go full lawyer, I ended up getting the call that Joy was leaving and that I should audition for the 790 job. So that's kind of how it happened.
Yeah, and I feel like you said, Amber, everyone who's gone through the industry has gone through some very... By the way, I just became the guy that I hate. I don't like it when we use either the industry or the business because we make it seem like we're in Hollywood and it's Tom Hanks talking with George in the industry. Like, no, we do radio. But either way, people who make their way through this that we do all take a very circuitous route to it, and that's like way circuitous, even more than what I had to do. So I kind of find that element fascinating. But one of the things, though, that I do find interesting, I do think that what is it like being a woman in sports media is a very kind of trite question now. But to me, the thing that is fascinating, that particularly in the Me Too age, how women who work in this industry kind of have to all be advocates for each other. Have you found that to be the case, that when you took the job from Joy, did Joy reach out? And have you been sort of trying to mentor younger women and try and get more women involved? Because that certainly is an area that still, particularly in sports, we have huge steps to take.
Yeah, but that's changed a lot over the last decade plus that I've been in this business. I mean, that has changed, I would say, quite dramatically. Now, I would say there's a lot more support amongst women. When I first got into this business back in the mid-2000s, I felt like it was a lot more catty than it is today. And I think part of that is just women realizing that we all do have a place here, and that really our competition isn't just each other. We should be competing for the positions that men hold as well. And I think now we feel like we actually have that opportunity a lot more. People don't realize really how new women are in this business. I mean, this isn't the sports industry is definitely not on par with a lot of other industries in terms of the entrance of women into the business. I mean, this has been a very slow progression. It's still very much a man's world, and that's in sports generally, and that carries over to the broadcasting side too. So I think what it used to feel like is there was only a few jobs that they would consider women for, and so I would show up to these auditions, it would be the same women, and so they would only be auditioning women, and they would be auditioning for sort of the woman role. And the woman role on all these shows, and this drove me crazy in my 20s, which was a huge reason that I went to law school, is I kept getting all of these opportunities for roles that were very, in my opinion, very kind of the cupcake hosty role. It was the typical woman on the show was not actually the one allowed to give an opinion, and she was the one just sort of introducing topics or asking questions, or she was the one on the sidelines. And that has changed some. I will say, now that I said that, if our listeners look around and take note, they will still notice that a lot of the way that the shows are constructed and a lot of the opportunities in this business are still sort of women setting up the questions or introducing the whatever, and they're not actually the ones providing the analysis or providing what I would call sort of the meat of the conversation. But there are more women who have been allowed to do that of late. And that's definitely the direction that the business is going. I do think that back a decade ago, certainly 2 decades ago, there was just those cupcake roles, and so every woman was competing for the same role, and it was a lot more catty back then. And now I feel like women have realized, hey, we're not the enemy, and now we're a lot more willing to sort of help each other and stand on each other's shoulders and help climb our way up, because we're all in the same position, which is great.
Yeah, I want to expand on that a little bit here for part 2. So let's get into the business a little more, because as you mentioned that, I'm thinking about what's happened in sports media. And just off the top of my head, you have Jamel Hill, you've got Katie Nolan, who I don't think ESPN uses quite enough, and Michelle Beadle has been very outspoken on a lot of things. I know a lot of people in Miami don't love it because she was anti-Miami a lot during the Big Three era. But, I mean, that's just off the top of my head. So it does seem like there's been more inclusion in that way, like you said, to sort of make women equal partners on these shows, as opposed to, as you said, just sort of setting up the guys to then comment on things. Is there somebody that you watched, a woman in the business who you thought, okay, that's sort of the way that I want to do this? Is there somebody that you tried to model yourself after?
So it's an interesting question, because I referenced earlier that one of the reasons that I decided to go into this business was watching the women who were doing it when I was young, and then meeting Erin Andrews and watching her come up in the business and thinking, okay, when I was very young, when I'm in high school, I'm thinking that looks cool to be Erin Andrews and in college. And then I got into the business myself, and I started learning a lot of stuff, of course, about myself. I mean, your 20s, I mean, we're all learning about ourselves in our 20s and learning what we really want, and what you really want isn't always necessarily what you thought you wanted when you were young. And so my dream was always, okay, I'll be the sideline girl. And then as I got older, I realized I'm an incredibly opinionated person, and I'm a person who is very confident about my intellect, and I want to be able to express that. And I was really not particularly happy in just the hosty role. And so for me, I was looking around for a woman that had the type of role that I knew I wanted in my mind, and I could not find it 10 years ago. I mean, there really wasn't that many women who had the analytical role that I would have wanted. My preference, if I was in TV, sort of my dream, I suppose, although I don't know if I want to say that anymore. But, in television, if we're just talking television, which is where I started my career, if we take the show First Take, for example, I found out that as I've gotten older, I don't want to be the woman, Molly Curum, I believe, who does a wonderful job hosting that show. But I just realized with my personality, that role doesn't fit me as well. I would love to be Max Kellerman or Stephen A. Smith. Those roles fit me much better. And there are some women who have gotten to fill in on First Take. I know Jamel Hill is one of them. But even with those sorts of shows, these embrace debate shows, which is the direction the sports media went for quite some time, there weren't women who were getting those roles. It was still very much female host, men actually delivering the opinion. And there are a few women now. I mean, obviously you have women like Rachel Nichols, you have women who, you have like Susie Colburn, you have women who do it in particular sports and have huge platforms and are very opinionated. And then you do have women on Around the Horn, which is great. And like you mentioned, Michelle Beadle has gotten to be much more opinionated throughout the roles throughout her career. And so all these women are sort of getting that platform moving forward. But I wouldn't say there's still one particular woman that I look at and think she's got my dream job. I don't know if that exists. And I like that it doesn't exist at this point because I'd like to create it myself.
So now that you are in this opinion-giving role, how would you say your opinions are molded? Are you reading all day? Are you watching these debate shows? Because I think one of the things that perhaps listeners don't really understand is the work that goes into it. And yeah, you mentioned earlier how at times it's perhaps overstated how much work goes into it, and we make it sound at times like brain surgery because we want to make it seem like our jobs are actually difficult and not the dream jobs that everyone in our audience thinks them to be. But in terms of how you try to establish yourself as a different voice or someone who gives opinions that are perhaps contrary to those that are being given all the time, how do you actually go about on a day-to-day basis thinking through what you're going to say and being ready for 3.5 hours of anything?
I think before I became a lawyer, I thought sports broadcasting was a more difficult job than I do now. And only because I will say, I think being a lawyer is the hardest job in the world. I mean, being lawyers deal with so much stress because they're taking on other people's problems. And so I still practice on the side. And obviously I was practicing full time for a couple years before I went back into broadcasting with a radio job. And so now, having taken that time and practicing on the side, I will say that in comparison, sports radio sometimes does feel like a piece of cake because at the end of the day, it's fun and we're not curing cancer. Really, the preparation that's involved for me in preparing for the show is stuff that I was doing anyways because I'm a sports radio junkie. And so I was listening to the Le Batard show every day anyways, every chance I got. So that's a lot of what I was doing in my free time regardless, and that carries over to this job. Now, I make sure I do it, of course, and I definitely try to watch more games. The hardest part of hosting a morning show specifically is waking up at 4 a.m. and watching sports at night. That's the hardest part because sports happen late. And people don't realize it's not just a normal morning show. I mean, you have to actually talk about what happened the night before. And that can be somewhat difficult. And so just even planning that out, planning the naps out accordingly if there's a big Heat game that night. And so that's what I try to do. I sort of just do what I was doing anyways and try to ingest as much sports as I possibly can. But there are times that I might miss a day, and I'll just be honest. Hey, I'm not well read on that subject yet. Let me catch up.
We talk about how you didn't really see a woman that could be your model going forward. As you kind of carve out your job, what you want it to be over the next 15 to 20 years, are there younger women who've been reaching out to you, sort of asking you questions how to get into the business? Because I'll be honest about this, and Chris and I have talked about this. Like, we've started this network, right? And we're already at 5 pods. We're going to be at 9 podcasts by the summer. We're very diverse, but we're really diverse with all men, right? We're actively looking, for women who can be part of our network because we think it's important to add that perspective. I guess the question is, are you finding now that you've sort of broken through in this market? Because we go back, we did a podcast with Stu about talk radio in this market. And when you start thinking about that, like, there haven't been a lot of women who've broken through in South Florida. Like, I'm just thinking of the 2 stations. I mean, you mentioned Joy, obviously.
There's Joy and there's Anita Marks.
Allison Williams obviously has come out of this market and done, a lot of stuff, but she didn't do radio. She did more television. But I can't even think. I mean, I can think of people who've been producers or promotional or interns, but I can't really think of a lot of sort of young women who've come up through the business. And maybe that's the fault, honestly, of the radio stations down here, too, that they haven't cultivated that talent. But I'm just curious for you, have women reached out to you and said, hey, how do I get in the business? How did you do this?
Yes. But I will say that most of the women who I run into, the young women, are trying to go into TV. And I do think when it comes to sports radio, sports radio is niche anyways, I think for men and women. But men understand the reach of sports radio and I think sort of embrace the genre more. And women still visualize when they're trying to get into this business, hey, I need to be on television, and think that television is where it's at. I mean, there's really not, you're mentioning down here, and yeah, maybe management could do a better job, but there's not many women nationally. I mean, the entire country. I mean, there are some women. I'm not the only one, but there's nothing compared to the amount of men in the sports radio business. So it's just not thought of often. And I do think that, frankly, there is a sexism component there where men watch sports and men want to see women, is this idea, which I don't even think is true, because men seem to have no problem listening to me. But I think that's the idea that a lot of people have. So they think, okay, woman, need to put her on television. And then these young women think, okay, I need to be on television. And I do think women in this business, young women, feel a lot more pressure to be attractive than men do. And that sort of plays into this whole idea of being seen. And the problem with being seen is sometimes you're seen and you're not heard. And that's how I felt a lot in the business. And that's why, for me, going into radio was such an opportunity. But even for me, when I decided to go on radio, I mean, my family was looking at me like, oh, what are you doing? Like, there's not much prestige to radio. And a lot of people don't realize that you can, of course, have a very viable career in radio. And there's a lot of big names, and given they're all men, but they've made a lot of money in this business. And I hope that more young women go into it. I really do. I think that the reason that you're having a hard time finding young women who would want to contribute to your podcast is, frankly, it's just there aren't that many women who recognize, when they're young in this business, that recognize the importance of maybe putting that in their arsenal of skills. And they could really be benefited by it, because I will say that I think a woman on sports radio gets instant respect in a way that you don't get when you say you're on television, in terms of knowing your stuff. Like, if I tell people I'm a sports radio host, they think, man, she must know her stuff.
Yeah, I think that's a big difference. And so we're going to put it out here again on this podcast. If you are a young woman who knows sports and is looking to get in the business, reach out to us at 5 Reasons Sports, because we're certainly looking for candidates. All right, let's move on to the next part here. Let's try to have a little bit of fun with this one. We talk about your role on the morning show. Give us a story about your three primary people that you work with in there, which is Zaslow, Romberg, and Tobin.
Oh, stories. Oh, goodness. Well, of course, most of the stories would revolve around Romberg, because Romberg is constant shenanigans. Romberg is the least professional of the crew, but he has that professional athlete thing about him, where he's just so sort of lovable meathead guy that he plays the role so well that I always joke with him, because he can get away with murder, and we're always joking with him about it. Romberg would, show up to the show a little intoxicated from the night before. Still, there was a couple of those shows, rolling a little late. There was a couple mornings where his hair was a little bit more than disheveled, and he had clearly had a very extraordinarily rough night. And those are things that people who are not professional athletes would probably not attempt to do. But Romberg is Romberg, and it goes with his whole shtick. So it works for him. And so he's endless entertainment. I mean, my first couple weeks on the show, Romberg was doing a weight loss competition with his friends. Now, Romberg is closer to his guy friends than any guy I've ever known. But again, I think it's that whole professional athlete thing. Athletes are really, really close to their guy friends, because they have that sort of locker room camaraderie. And then it carries on into every aspect of their life. So it even carries on into retirement. So I think they have closer relationships with their male friends than just the average guy. So Romberg has these male friends who most of them are former players, and he's really, really close to them. And they were doing this weight loss competition, and like 2 weeks on the show, he came in with his friends, and they did a weigh-in for the competition, and they all got down to their underwear. And when I'm talking underwear, I'm talking these guys were like naked and in the studio. And I'm thinking, oh my God, what did I get myself into? I mean, I'm like 2 weeks in the show. My co-host is practically naked. I don't know where HR is, but it was extraordinarily ridiculous. I mean, we do these other events. I mean, there was this, of course, we have during football season, we have this, the everyone has their own version of the, Wheel of Death or the Wheel of Doom or the Dartboard of Doom or whatever. So of course we have one of those as well. And if you pick the games wrong and you lose, then you have to do some sort of humiliation. We call it a humiliation pool. And one of the humiliations one time was that they had to take a swim class at the JCC, and it was Tobin and Romberg and Slim. And we got an instructor at the JCC. It was water aerobics. And so we figured that some nice old lady was going to teach it at the JCC. And the JCC set up to have one of their trainers, who was this huge jacked guy named Rob. Big Rob, and he was just huge, jacked muscle guy, and he did this water aerobics class with these 3 guys, and he murdered them. And I mean, I thought they were going to die, and they were getting out of the pool, they're doing push-ups, they're getting back. I mean, they were so out of shape compared to this dude, and so, dying. And Romberg has on a little brief. He has on a woman's bathing suit, but just the brief bottoms, and it was a woman's because he wanted to wear a bathing suit, but they only had a woman's one apparently, so it was a bikini bottom, and that's what he was wearing, and that didn't go well. So we're just fortunate that HR for Entercom, which is the company that owns our station, is located in some other states, so they're not always aware of Romberg's shenanigans. So Romberg, we have stories for days. He's by far the most unprofessional but entertaining on the show, and he always shows up, and he's always there, and he's always ready to go. And he just provides endless entertainment. So I don't have any of those sorts of stories about Zaslow, because Zaslow is the more consummate professional sports radio guy he's the one who's been doing it for 15 years. So he sort of knows how to pick and choose when to participate in the shenanigans and when not to with Zaslow. But with Zaslow, our thing with him is that we're always making fun of him because of how Zaslow dresses, because Zaslow's fashion taste is not necessarily the best. And so Zaslow right now, the reason Zaslow's been out, the reason I drove the show today is because he was at Boog Shambi's charity event in New York City. And every year Boog Shambi has this charity event, and Zaslow goes, and it's a gala. And Zaslow to this gala always dresses, it leaves a lot to be desired in the fashion department. So a couple of days ago, he told us that he was going to be out yesterday and today, and he was going to the event, and that he was going to go shopping. That this year he was going to go shopping. He was going to get a fly outfit so that we couldn't make fun of him on the radio. And then, of course, today we get a picture texted to us all this morning. That's a picture of Zaslow with Pablo Torre at the event, and Zaslow's wearing the same blazer. I swear it's the same blazer he's always worn. If he went out and shopped, then he bought the same blazer that's 6 sizes too big for him and clearly reminiscent of 1992. But it's the same blazer. But he bought a new shirt to go under it, but he bought a black turtleneck. It's like a faux turtleneck. So he's wearing like a gray blazer with a black turtleneck in New York, which I think Zaslow just thinks that New York City, because it's north, that it's automatically cold, I guess. But of course, it's the end of May, so it's 70-something degrees in New York, and he's in a turtleneck at this gala looking like a mafioso with the gray jacket and the black turtleneck. So that's Zaslow for you. And then Tobin is just a bleepster, as I like to call him. Tobin has the most ridiculous takes on planet Earth. And I swear he lays around at night thinking, what take can I have that is the most ridiculous take? And out of that, Tobin ends up doing things like eating crow on Sports Center and jumping around in kangaroo costumes, and because he got in a fight with somebody in Australian Parliament, and like all this ridiculous stuff. And it's because his takes are always pure insanity, and he's always thinking of these trades that would never happen in reality and trying to convince everyone they're happening. And that's Tobin's thing. And somehow Tobin has parlayed his insane takes into a larger platform because, of course, he got the midday show as well and often fills in on the morning show. And he's the only one of us who's ever been on Sports Center. So Tobin's made it. Somehow he won Broadcaster of the Year one year for, Slice or somebody. And he's very proud of that. And it's ridiculous because he's shenanigans. So he's sort of like the Stu Gatz of the morning show.
And we want people to be able to listen to this podcast. I'm not going to ask you for a Slim story. We'll just move on from there and allow Slim to entertain people on our Ballscast pod, where if you have not listened to that yet, you should, not with the children around, but should definitely check that out here every Friday. And now let's take a quick break.
Welcome to the Heat Beat Podcast. I'm your host, Carla Navas, and with us today was Michael Wallace of Grind City Media, formerly of ESPN and used to cover the Heat. Michael shared all sorts of great stories with us, from the time he called Gary Payton a liar to what actually happened to Rafer Alston in 2009, not to mention this incredible Udonis Haslem story.
So one of the funniest stories is that after he got married, he tied the knot with Faith, his wife. Their walk-off song when they walked away from the podium was Tupac's and Snoop's Two of America's Most Wanted. Ain't nothing but a gangster party. That's how they walked off the stage from their wedding, with that.
That's what I'm talking.
After they kissed the bride, they started playing that one.
Check out all that and more on the Heat Beat Podcast, now on the 5 Reasons Podcast Network.
All right, so let's move to some of your takes. You talked about how you're extraordinarily opinionated. So we're going to try to do these rapid fire, Amber. Okay, so we're gonna pick sort of the real hot button topics. As you mentioned, it's not a great time for South Florida sports in terms of where the teams stand, because it seems like everybody's pretty much the 9th seed or mediocre or somewhere around there. And additionally, this is just not a real busy time of the schedule, but there's still things going on. So I'm going to let you go here. What should the Heat do with Hassan Whiteside?
Okay, so I'm the only person, I think, in South Florida sports media, maybe the media period, who has defended Hassan at all. And the reason I have isn't so much that I'm pro Hassan. It's not that I think he's the answer to the Heat's problems, but Hassan, we know what Hassan is. And my opinion is that the Heat also know what Hassan is and who Hassan is. And they chose to sign a player for $100 million because he's a great player and he's a great center. And they chose to sign him because they knew what value he did bring to them, despite the fact that he has what I would call, how do I say it? Like he's got certain sensitivities. He is a player who bounced around, of course, a lot in the league, had to play overseas, was playing basketball at the YMCA. And a lot of that wasn't because of athletic ability or ability at all. A lot of that seems like it might have been about immaturity and because of his emotional fortitude. And the Heat found a way to coddle Hassan and put Hassan in a position to be the best version of himself. And then it seems that they sort of forgot how to deal with him at some point. So the Heat became this team that they unlocked the key to Hassan, and they found the perfect way to deal with him and to get the most out of him. And then this season stopped getting the most out of him. And it wasn't that he couldn't provide the most anymore. It was that they weren't treating him in the manner in which he apparently needed to be treated in order to give the Heat what the Heat needed. And I think a lot of that has to fall on the Heat and the coaching staff, frankly, because we all know that Hassan needs that coddling. Hassan is going to get pouty about minutes. So if you're managing his minutes, maybe you keep him in the game to avoid the pout, even if he's maybe not working with your game plan as much. Or maybe you make the game plan so that he is more part of the game plan because, frankly, you do need him. You don't have enough weapons. And because Hassan needs that sort of emotional help. So it's not that I defend Hassan being emotionally sensitive or needing that coddling, but it's just the reality is that he does need it, and that's what the Heat signed up for. And I think if that's what you signed up for and you paid the man $100 million, then you've got to continue to do that and continue to find a way to reach him. And we saw that really this was a result of his poutiness. And frankly, it was a season where he was injured as well. So it was a season where he was already, I think, going to be down on himself and already having a hard time with that. And then, of course, to be restricted so severely. And he was kept out of the fourth quarter of games sort of inexplicably at times. And by the way, why not just let him foul out instead of trying to bench him and then put him in this mood where then he's not even trying during the playoffs. He's not giving you anything. And it was just so obvious to me that he was just doing it all on purpose. And so everybody wants to get on Hassan, but I'm thinking, okay, but what did you need to do to get the most out of him? And I think that they had the answer to that, and they had done it in the past. And frankly, I don't think it's that hard to know how to coddle Hassan, because the fact is he just needs it, and he needs to feel like he's important, and he needs to feel like he's needed, and he needs to feel like he's wanted. And so I think that when you have a player like him and you signed up for it and you paid him the big bucks, you got to find a way to make him feel those things. And then we got the Instagram story from Hassan, a week ago or 2 weeks ago? He's been really quiet on social media, but we got that Instagram story from Hassan where he's shooting jumpers in the gym. And he says it's not that I can't shoot a jumper, but that they won't let me. And I thought, man, that is so dead on what I have been saying. I mean, it's not that he can't play. It's not that he can't make a basket. It's not that he can't give you max effort. It's that he's not doing it on purpose. And he's not doing it on purpose because he's so disgruntled. And I think some of that has to fall on the staff for allowing him to get to a place where he's so disgruntled.
All right, let's move now to the Dolphins, and it does feel like a bit like Groundhog Day with them, where we're just constantly, every year we ask, is Ryan Tannehill good enough? But the last time we saw him, he was leading the team towards a playoff run and was one of the better quarterbacks in the league. Now, he's had 2 major injuries since, but do you feel like they can get him back to something like that form and allow him to maybe even make a run at a playoff spot? I think that's unlikely given the roster change around him, but they feel probably like they can challenge for the playoffs. Do you feel like they can?
I mean, the initial reports about Tannehill is that he looks great in OTAs. So Dolphin fans, of course, can be very excited about that. But no one knows what we're going to get out of Tannehill at this point. Nobody really knows how durable Tannehill is, if those injuries were just more of a lack of line in front of him, and if his line is going to be better. I mean, all of that is still up in the air. I think with Tannehill, what we do know we have is a quarterback who is okay. And that's really all you need if you have a really good team around a quarterback. I think that we learned that this past season. If you have a team who's maybe not so great, then sure, you need Tom Brady. If you have a team who's really, really, really good, then you can win with a quarterback who's, good or okay. And that's what we have in Ryan Tannehill. So it's maybe an interesting strategy to Dolphin fans not to have drafted a quarterback during this draft. I didn't have a huge problem with them not doing that, frankly. I think that if they weren't, in fact, high on the guys at the top of the draft, we don't know what the truth is or not, but it seemed like from the reports that came out, there was one guy who they liked, and then the rest of those quarterbacks in that first round, they weren't very high on. And the one guy who they liked went with one of the top few picks, and the asking price was too high to move up to be able to draft that person. If that is, in fact, the case, I don't have a huge problem with it because you knew you were going to get a huge upgrade at quarterback anyways this season. You didn't have to make a single move, and you'd get a huge upgrade at quarterback because no matter what you think of Ryan Tannehill, he is a huge upgrade from Jay Cutler. So already the Dolphins have made a huge upgrade. And then you see how Ryan Tannehill pans out. And if you weren't particularly high on a bunch of the quarterbacks at the top of this draft, even if it was a good quote-unquote quarterback draft, then you wait until you're in a drafting position where maybe you do find somebody who you are more high on if you need to in the future. But maybe you don't need to. Maybe Ryan Tannehill finally becomes a little better. I mean, he's not going to ever be great. He's not going to be Tom Brady. We know that at this point. He's not young. He's been in the league for a long time. But I think he's good enough that maybe if you build around him, that the Dolphins can do some sort of damage or at least build towards the future. I'm not that sad about the Ryan Tannehill aspect. I think that there's a lot of other question marks on this team because no matter what, it can't be as bad as last year at the quarterback position.
All right. Speaking of things that are bad right now, it's the Marlins, although not as bad as maybe we thought. And my question for you, because this is another of the most polarizing topics in South Florida right now, are you comfortable with Derek Jeter's plan for the franchise moving forward?
I mean, do we really know what Derek Jeter's plan is? Other than to break it up and then allegedly build it and break it down and build it back up. And we don't really have a timeline for that. I mean, in the next 4 or 5 years, he said. I think it's interesting that he completely broke it down, and then we were at points in the season this season where the Marlins were looking at the same record that they were when they had Giancarlo Stanton and Christian Yelich and Dee Gordon and these other guys. That was interesting to me because I could see why you wouldn't want to spend the money. Spending the money on those guys obviously wasn't putting you in a winning position anyway. So I understand his thought process. It's hard when you're a Marlins fan and you feel like you had the pieces that all you needed was a few more. But I do understand that it is a business and that you do have to look at it from a business perspective. This is a business that had been completely mismanaged. I think anybody who was buying the team, it's not that I necessarily agree with the strategy, but any of these people interested in buying the team seemed like they were going to blow the team up. And I know there was some questions about whether Jorge Mas was, and a lot of Marlins fans were saying, oh, Jorge Mas, he was the answer. He was so rich. And now there's been some questions about how rich really was he? And I felt like there was just a lot of assumptions being made when it came to the dealings of the Marlins and of the Loria Marlins and now of the Jeter Marlins. And I think at this point, we all just have to let it play out. I don't think that you can be too critical yet because he told you that this is going to be terrible initially and that he has a plan in the future. We don't know exactly what that plan is or how he's going to get there, or even if his ownership is really going to be willing to get there and start spending some money at some point when the team isn't necessarily making money and attendance isn't necessarily rising, because I don't see how attendance is going to rise until they start winning. But right now, I will give him somewhat of a benefit of a doubt. I do think everyone has been unbelievable. I think that there is a hangover of the Loria days when we're talking about Derek Jeter. And it's not that I think Jeter has made all the right moves, but I also don't think his moves have been as terrible or as unexpected anyways as everyone has acted like they are. And I think it's just because people are just so mad at the Marlins that it doesn't matter what the Marlins do. The Marlins have an offshore company that owns 1/1,000,000th of the team, which is a really, really common thing to do. And when you're talking about these super large scale entities, then we act like it's some big controversy and people are flying down to the Cayman Islands or wherever that entity was, acting like that was some sort of unusual event, when in fact it wasn't at all. So I'll go ahead and reserve judgment and just have to see where this takes us with this new ownership group.
All right, let's get on to part 5 now here with Amber Wilson. Again, you can follow her at AmberW790, and also she works for, as she mentioned, she's a partner at Lindsay Wilson PLLC. What does that stand for, Amber? That's
the name of that's my last name. That's my fiance's last name, my last name, PLLC. It's just a personal that's a law firm thing, a personal liability corporation.
I was always supposed to go to law school. I never did. So I guess I should have, actually, as we're setting up this corporation. Let's get to something that you dealt with personally here. You still have the pinned tweet here on your Twitter account. I heard the words that this is from June 8th, 2017. I heard the words that I've been dreaming about hearing since I was told I have cancer on 11/22/16. My margins are clear. I'm cancer free. You've talked a lot about what you want your career to be, how you envision it. During that period of time, when you found out that you had cancer, and during those 9 or so months that you were, or 7 or so months that you were fighting it off before you found out that your margins were clear, did you change at all what your goals were? And just could you speak a little bit to what you dealt with during that time?
Sure. When I first got diagnosed in November of 2016, and of course, that came as a complete, total and utter shock. I mean, Chris had mentioned how healthy I try to always be, and I always have been pretty extraordinarily healthy, I think, and really try to maintain myself, work out all the time. I used to even work as a personal trainer a million years ago. So I'm pretty tuned into fitness and nutrition and all that kind of stuff, and I feel like I've lived a pretty healthy lifestyle. So I just didn't expect to get cancer, and certainly not to get cancer at 32, and that's what happened. But cancer can happen to anybody, and frankly, it doesn't matter how healthy you are. That helps, and it helps you fight it. So that's not an endorsement to go eat Cheetos like Ethan does, but in the mornings. But it is, it's just a fact. Anybody can get cancer at any time in their lives. And so I was diagnosed in November 2016. Like you mentioned, I was cancer-free by June of 2017. My margins were clear, and I had a really short battle compared to so many cancer patients, and it was not easy. And I had a double mastectomy and reconstruction and then multiple other surgeries, and it was not a good time, of course, at all. But it was an easier path than a lot of young cancer patients, because I learned a whole lot about cancer going through, of course, this experience. And what I learned was that cancer is a lot more deadly under 40 than it is over 40. And it's because when you're young, you're, particularly with breast cancer, you're a lot less likely to catch it because you're just not expecting it. So a lot of young women don't catch it. You also are more likely to get more aggressive strains of cancer. They don't really know why. Maybe it's because you're more hormonal, because you are young and healthy, whatever it is. So it grows faster, it can be rampant, the type of strains that you have. And I was really, really fortunate in a lot of ways that I was in a position that I was able to catch it early and I was able to fight it quite easily and have my margins cleared within a pretty short period of time. So when I first got diagnosed, it was a total shock. I think my initial reaction was that I just wanted to move back to Sarasota where my parents are and just curl up in a ball and cry. I mean, I think your initial reaction is just always, you need your family and you need to be around the people who you love, and you're just, you just want to go hide somewhere. And of course I didn't do that. And I ended up working as much as I could through my treatment. I of course missed a lot of time from the show, but I worked as much as I could. And when I did work, I found that for me was actually a really nice break. When I was on air, I'm talking about sports. I'm not thinking about the fact that I had cancer. And that ended up being really helpful to me in my journey. I talked to a lot of cancer patients, a lot of young cancer patients who I counsel. And that's one of the things I tell them, like, hey, if you feel good enough and you can work, do it, because you'll find that it'll give you a mental break from what you're going through. And so I really, really appreciated sports in a way that I never had before. And I, of course, loved sports up to that point, but I really, really appreciated coming to work and just talking about sports and thinking about sports. And we all know at the end of the day, sports, it doesn't really matter. And that is the beauty of it, is that it's not, no one is curing cancer when it comes to sports. And that's not what we're doing when we're talking about sports. And that's what makes it so great, because there is so much bad in this world and there's so much serious stuff going on in people's lives, and sports provides that escape to people. And so what I think it did was make me realize why people get so upset when we as sports commentators do get into some of these issues that we all think are incredibly important. And we're all very opinionated people, if you're in particularly sports radio, or if you're a sports journalist. And so we are people who probably tend to also have opinions about politics and social issues. And we feel that we have a platform where maybe we can do some good in the world, and maybe we can sort of share those opinions sometimes. But I understood when I had cancer why people going through terrible things in their own lives, or even if they just hate their job, or they're just whatever, they have a bad marriage, whatever they're going through, and they turn on their radio or they turn on their TV and they just want to talk about that game last night, because that's where they get their enjoyment from, because it's not so serious. And then there's some discussion about something that even maybe they agree with, but it's just very serious. I sort of started to understand that perspective, which was interesting to me, because of course, I tend to sort of agree with some of the social commentary that we get with sports sometimes, of course. I think a lot of us who go into this industry feel a certain way about some social issues and maybe even some political issues. And I started to kind of see the other side of that, and why people may not always want to hear about the heavy stuff and where they're coming from when they fight against you, when you go there. So that was interesting. I didn't really change my goals or my aspirations, but that was sort of the one thing that changed for me. I mean, my initial thought during that time was just sort of to survive. And then once I figured out that I was going to survive, knock on wood, hopefully have a very long life and hopefully stay cancer free, then, I after that point, it wasn't so much about me or my future, but, it did shape my views in some ways.
That's good stuff there. And again, congratulations on your recent engagement. We saw those photos on IG. It looks like your fiance did a pretty good job with that proposal. I think a lot of us could have learned from that. Maybe Chris someday will learn from that in terms of the way that he set that up. Again, you can follow her at Amber W790. We could talk to you for 3 hours, but I'm really hungry for Cheetos, so I'm going to go find some of those. I think I have some in the cabinet, and then get them all over the computer as we post the episode. Hopefully you guys will enjoy this. And Amber, you're welcome to come on anytime. And also, you are welcome, as I said, to suggest any other women in the business who are or are looking to get into the business, because I got too many damn guys in this network at this point. It's ridiculous.
We need to get more women in this sports radio, sports talk business. It's good. There needs to be more. There needs to be more female opinion on sports radio.
I'm definitely,
and on podcasts.
And on podcasts. Yeah, that's right.
On
we're adding the 5 Reasons Sports Podcast Network. That's exactly right. Amber, thanks for doing it. We appreciate it. And again, you can check her out on the morning show every day, Monday through Friday, with Zaslow, with Romberg, and also with Tobin and with Slim. Thanks, Amber.
Thanks.